On to Module 2, Functional Analysis of Verbal Behavior. Here are the objectives for this module. In this Edpuzzle, we're going to focus on the definition of verbal behavior and describing, stating, and identifying examples of verbal behavior in comparison with nonverbal behavior. We'll be discussing Norman's article in depth in class. If you've taken radical behaviorism, you've read some of Skinner's work before, but his book Verbal Behavior can be quite a different experience. It's dense reading, but if you go line by line considering the take-home points of each of Skinner's statements, it's not so bad. For these first couple of chapters, we'll do that together. Starting out right on page 1. Men act upon the world and change it, and are changed in turn by the consequences of their actions. That is to say, behaviors have an effect on the environment, and those changes affect the rates of future behaviors. If by chance the environment changes, old forms of behavior disappear, while new consequences build new forms. Translated, the topography of behavior changes over time based on the changing consequences that affect it. Behavior alters the environment through mechanical action, and its properties or dimensions are often related in a simple way to the effects produced. Much of the time, however, a man acts only indirectly upon the environment from which the ultimate consequences of his behavior emerge. The behavior's effects, that is, the consequences that affect it in turn, can be direct or indirect. We'll discuss direct versus indirect actions shortly. Page 2. Here, Skinner talks about his problems with traditional non-behavior analytic accounts of verbal behavior. The term speech emphasizes vocal behavior. Language has come to refer to the practices of a linguistic community rather than the behavior of any one member. The adjective linguistic suffers from the same disadvantage. Note that none of these terms deal with the functional analysis of verbal behavior. The term verbal behavior was new academically when this book was written and didn't have a strong meaning in colloquial speech. Verbal behavior now emphasizes focus on the individual and actual behavior. Verbal behavior is, quite simply, behavior reinforced through the mediation of other persons, with some refinements, but we'll get to those later. It's important to note that the behavior of the listener in mediating the consequences of the behavior of the speaker is not necessarily verbal in any special sense. On to page 3. It's important to prove that we can apply the principles of behavior to verbal behavior. Skinner lists some practical questions to consider about the usefulness of verbal behavior and its study. How can the teacher establish the specific verbal repertoires which are the principal end product of education? How can the therapist uncover latent verbal behavior in a therapeutic interview? How can the writer evoke his own verbal behavior in the act of composition? And how can the scientist, mathematician, or logician manipulate his verbal behavior in productive thinking? Next, Skinner provides a description of other linguistic, semantic, etc. fields with elaboration on why they don't qualify as behavior analytic approaches. Many of these fields focus on historical changes in word usage, meaning, etc., rather than on individuals' current behavior. With regards to research, there is no manipulation of independent variables and subsequent measure of effect of dependent variables. Ultimately, these are formal, that is, topographical analyses, not functional. Next, the reasons to study verbal behavior. These were actually reviewed last week. By our account, control over behavior lies outside of the organism. That is, behavior is affected by environmental manipulations and it's not caused by thoughts, interests, ideas, etc. With that being said, don't forget that radical behaviorists hold the position that we are able to study thoughts, interests, ideas, etc. because they are behaviors in and of themselves. We'll review pages 6 through 9 in one chunk here. We don't use words like tools. This wouldn't be a parsimonious interpretation. Words don't have inherent meaning. Function can't be determined by topography. For example, why might someone say it's raining outside? They might simply be commenting on it with the behavior reinforced by conversation about the weather. Alternately, they might be attempting to make the variable more salient, such that another person agrees that they shouldn't walk to the store today. Or perhaps they're actually asking for an umbrella. Determining what a phrase means doesn't explain its occurrence in the moment. Cat corresponds to the concept of cats developed by our verbal community, but why did the client just say that word? On pages 10 through 11, Skinner suggests that we seek causes of behavior which have acceptable scientific status and which, with luck, will be susceptible to measurement and manipulation. That is, we want to describe, explain, and control verbal behavior. Behavior is usually the effect of multiple causes. Separate variables combine to extend their functional control, and new forms of behavior emerge from the recombination of old fragments. While we'll be starting out in this class talking about quote-unquote pure operants, we'll end by talking about multiple sources of control affecting each instance of behavior. A speaker is normally also a listener. He reacts to his own behavior in several important ways. That is, a speaker can be their own listener. We'll talk more about that later in this term as well. On to Chapter 2. Meaning is not a property of behavior as such, but of the conditions under which behavior occurs. Again, this is driving home the point that no behavior, including vocal words, inherently means anything. It's all about the function in the moment. We do not and cannot specify any one form, mode, or medium. Any movement capable of affecting another organism may be verbal. They may not compose an organized language. In other words, verbal behavior can take the form of any topography, not just vocal speech. We'll talk about some more extreme examples shortly. The terms response and operant allow us to make the distinction between an instance of behavior and a kind of behavior. We'll review those definitions of these terms momentarily. A repertoire as a collection of verbal operants describes the potential behavior of a speaker. Repertoire is a better term to use than vocabulary. Note that each vocabulary word can serve many different functions. Skinner goes on to talk about how probability or strength relates to a practitioner's work of teaching verbal behavior. Of course, we don't simply want to observe high rates of relatively arbitrary verbal behavior. It should be under contextual control. However, fluency is important. If a verbal operant is truly learned, it should be retained over time such that in appropriate situations it's likely to reoccur. Verbal behavior should endure to the extent that successively longer and longer conversations can occur. One's repertoire should be stable in the sense that verbal behavior can continue to appropriately occur even in the presence of distractions and stress. But again, keep in mind that momentary strength is also a function of both SDs and MOs. Certain audiences may occasion stronger and more consistent verbal behavior because of how they've reacted to that verbal behavior in the past. Indicators of strength other than probability, such as energy, speed, and repetitiveness, don't always vary together. Someone may speak quietly at a whisper, or say the quote-unquote correct thing but repeat it unnecessarily, or speak at a normal volume but very slowly. How then would you determine whether a given operant is strong in a learner's repertoire? Again, it all comes back to probability. The likelihood that what the verbal community deems correct, what they are likely to reinforce, is omitted under appropriate circumstances. Skinner ends the second chapter with a discussion of independent variables that can affect verbal behavior, perhaps most notably shaping. We begin by reinforcing any behavior which is part of the final pattern. Any response which vaguely resembles the standard behavior of the community is reinforced. When these begin to appear frequently, a closer approximation is insisted upon. Reinforcement of successive approximations to a target behavior. He again notes that the audience has stimulus control over behavior, but other stimuli in the environment do as well, and some operants are evoked by specific MOs. We'll talk about what environmental variables affect and control each operant in individual upcoming modules. So now we come to a full definition of verbal behavior. Behavior reinforced through the mediation of other persons who must be responding in ways which have been conditioned precisely in order to reinforce the behavior of the speaker. For verbal behavior, maintaining reinforcement is mediated by another organism. Reinforcement is not direct acting or automatic the way it is with nonverbal behavior. Interaction in the total verbal episode is what differentiates verbal behavior from the more general category of social behavior. the behavior must be under the stimulus control of an audience, and the organism engaging in verbal behavior also must have the capacity to behave as an audience, i.e., reinforce the verbal behavior of others. A lot of human behavior is direct acting. The organism acts upon the world and changes it as a result. The organism is also changed by the consequences of the actions. However, humans in particular also act indirectly upon the environment. In the case of indirect actions, the first effect is on another individual rather than on the environment. An indirect action would be to ask for a glass of water, consequated by someone giving you a glass of water. A direct action would be to go and get a glass of water yourself. The former is an example of verbal behavior, where the latter is an example of nonverbal behavior. The indirect action requires a verbal mediator or another individual, that is, an audience or listener, to carry out the act of reinforcing that response. Simply asking for a glass of water without someone available to bring you a glass of water will not be reinforced, but it is still verbal behavior. We'll talk about that in class. Here's another. If you're cold and turn on the thermostat, nonverbal. If you say, "It's cold in here, could you turn up the heat?" and someone else walks over to turn up the thermostat, that's verbal. You try one. You see a maple leaf. What would be an example of nonverbal behavior? What about a verbal behavior? Our examples have been vocal thus far, but keep in mind that verbal behavior does not have to be vocal. Verbal and vocal are not synonyms. See maple leaf, write maple leaf is also a verbal operant response, even though it's written and not spoken. On the other side of that coin, there are instances of vocal behavior that are probably not verbal. For example, gasping in surprise, crying out in pain, snoring, coughing. These are probably reflexes. Note that they all can be verbal, but often aren't. We'll quickly zoom through a few other potential topographies of verbal behavior. We have the Picture Exchange Communication System, PEX, Morse code, gestures, more specific subsets of gestures such as sign language. If we start really getting out there, semaphore, positioning of flags to communicate to other ships. Now we're getting silly, but I love this form of communication, memes. In some verbal communities, simply exchanging these types of pictures can contact very specific forms of mediated social reinforcement. Smoke signals are another example quite removed from vocal behavior. And then we can really stretch the limits. How about scratch and sniff stickers? Might these have differential effects on quote-unquote listeners' behavior, such that using one sticker or another might be different verbal operants? Maybe. Now let's go back and review some basic terms. What is a response? A response class? Note that this is also sometimes referred to as an operant or an operant class. So what is a repertoire? Let's consider whether each of these examples are cases of responses or response classes. Can I have a glass of water? Behavior that is evoked by water deprivation. Asking a friend for a drink. Behavior evoked by feeling itchy. Scratching your back. Drawing your fingernails gently back and forth across your arm. What are some examples of responses in the response class of getting the teacher's attention? Classes of behavior can be divided up based on their function or their topography. In the case of function-based definitions, we're grouping together responses that produce the same type of reinforcement. For example, any response maintained by reinforcement in the form of the teacher responding to your question. An example could be raising your hand. A topography-based definition could be something like simply moving one's hand above one's shoulder. That could serve many different functions, but if, for example, we're just assessing motor capabilities, this type of definition might be useful. Since our unit of analysis is not purely formal, we cannot be sure that all instances of a response are instances of the same operant. This is so important to our analysis. One form of verbal behavior could serve many different functions. Even if we're talking about words that people generally agree on the meaning of, we don't necessarily know what function that word serves in the moment. Of course, it often comes down to a functional assessment, identification of the variables of which the behavior is a function. That is, identifying antecedents and consequences that evoke, occasion, and maintain a response. Behavior does not occur in a vacuum, so we can't determine its function just by looking at the behavior alone. We can only assess function by analyzing the behavior in the context of environmental variables. So this behavior is functionally different behavior when compared to this one. In a similar comparison, this is probably verbal behavior, while this is probably not, since the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement rather than socially mediated reinforcement. Of course, it can become verbal if it does come under the control of socially mediated reinforcement. Unit by unit, we'll be covering the elementary verbal operants. These are the functional units of verbal behavior, the operant classes, and they're functionally independent from each other. That is, they are maintained by different types of reinforcement.